So I was telling you last time that Plato's theory of human nature involves a transformation of the soul towards wisdom and moral excellence, and a sublimation of our erotic drives into the desire to procreate in beauty. So there's a lot more to Plato's theory of human nature, but that's very decisive. The other thing I was saying last time is that the human soul, according to Plato, is tripartite. It has three parts. And one part, like a black horse, like a steed, is the driving force of the soul. And that's called appetites. That's our desires. That's our drives. Without appetites, the soul doesn't move. So nothing great comes without great passion. Another dimension of the soul, I was saying, for Plato is spirit. But for Plato, the word spirit doesn't mean like a ghost or anything. It means like spirited. And another part of the soul is our intellect. It's what distinguishes the human animal from all the other animals. And the spirit is like a white horse. And the intellect is like a charioteer who's guiding the chariot. But their wings, and of course all this is a metaphor, the wings of the soul is eros, E-R-O-S, which normally translates into desire, sexual desire. But Plato takes that notion of eros and claims that the evolution of the human soul involves a spiritualization, a sublimation of eros, so that instead of procreating physically, or in addition to procreating physically, we procreate spiritually. There's spiritual procreation as well as physical procreation. Spiritual procreation has to do with creating something that lasts beyond your life and achieving earthly immortality, like Einstein's theory of relativity or Plato's dialogues or the Constitution of the United States. Those things are the children of those people who were capable of procreating spiritually. And that's the way the more evolved soul is able to participate in eternity. So Plato has two different theories of the immortality of the soul. One is the survival of the soul after the body, which we find throughout Plato's dialogues, especially that dialogue called Phaedo. But there's another kind of immortality, which Plato called earthly immortality. And it has to do with the evolution of the erotic drives of individuals, such that in addition to procreating physically, like making babies, they are able to create things that last beyond their lifetime and are gifts to posterity. And that's the way they participate in immortality. Like when I say the name Albert Einstein, he's still living, not physically, but his works are still living in the world of physics. Okay, so those are some of the things that I have been talking about. But now I'd like to concentrate on book 6 and 7, which I'd like you to read, of the Republic. I told you last time that by the time you get to book 6, Socrates has gotten everyone listening, especially Glaucon, with whom he's speaking, to accept the principle that, or the maxim, that there will be no end to the problems in the state until philosophers become rulers. So the wisest people need to rule, and the most virtuous people need to rule, because they'd be more apt to make proper choices, important choices that involve the citizens, and they won't be so tempted to act for self-gain. They'll be thinking about the common good, which is the keystone of Republican political theory. So they're talking about the education of the philosopher rulers. And I told you the Greek word for education is paideia, P-A-I-D-E-I-A. Now I want to concentrate on that because the education of the philosopher rulers is a roundabout way of talking about the evolution of the human soul. Okay, let's go over that a little bit more, because that's not something so obvious. There's what I might call the evolution of the human soul in Plato's philosophy of human nature. And that is, the human soul goes through a series of transformations, of stages. And when it reaches a very high stage, it comes back down to the people in order to become the occasion for the transformation and liberation of others. And so this movement, one could think in terms of the evolution of the human soul, the transformation of the soul towards wisdom and moral excellence. And the more we move towards wisdom and moral excellence, the more truly human we become, Plato thought. So this discussion in book 6 and book 7, which I'd like you to read, about the education of the philosopher rulers, that's a circumlocution, a roundabout way of talking about the evolution of the human soul. In fact, it's a theory of human nature, but human nature is dynamic for Plato. Humans go through a transformation. I don't know if you've noticed, but in one sense, we're all projections of divinity, and in that sense, we're all equal and divine, Plato believed. But on another level, not everybody is equal. There are some people who are like serial killers, other people like St. Francis, who is just full of love, overflowing with love. There are wise people and foolish people. Not everyone is the same. So why is everyone different? Well, we're different because of the idiosyncrasies and particularities of life, of course. We all come from different backgrounds, and we all have different experiences. We have different DNA, and that accounts for our individuality. But there's something else that's accounting for our individuality, and that's the stage of evolution that we've arrived at in our existence. So Plato tries to delineate these stages of evolution, these stages towards the transformation of the human soul towards wisdom and moral excellence. And he does this in two ways. At the end of book 6, there's what has come to be called the divided line. And then throughout book 7, which is the culmination of the whole book, the Republic, all 10 books of the Republic, it's called the Allegory of the Cave, which is probably the most famous passage in philosophy by any philosopher. People who just have the least amount of knowledge of philosophy have probably studied the Allegory of the Cave. And it's very profound and very deep. And it's both the divided line and the Allegory of the Cave are talking about the evolution of the human soul towards wisdom and moral excellence. And I told you there are 3 kinds of wisdoms in Plato. Speculative wisdom, which has to do with knowing the whole story of existence, divine and human. Practical wisdom, which has to do with making choices that lead to well-being. And wisdom speaking, which is nothing other than speculative wisdom and practical wisdom become articulate. And these are the 3 main qualities of a leader and of a ruler of the republic, of an ideal republic. But they're also the ideals for the true human being in this journey of transformation towards wisdom and moral excellence. So let me go over the divided line and Allegory of the Cave with you briefly, and you can get all the subtleties of that from the text itself. And like I said last time, in order to enrich the text and give you more of Plato than what's in the text, I'm going to read into the text, but I'm not going to read my own ideas into the text. I'm going to read ideas that are in Plato that are related to these ideas in the text that I've assigned. Now that's legitimate even if you're writing about Plato, but if you're doing that, if I'm interpreting a particular passage, and the art of interpretation is a skill that takes time and development. And then it's okay to go elsewhere and read this, the author's ideas into the ideas that you're interpreting, as long as you're not reading your own ideas into the text. Now, if you're critically responding to the text, then you let your reader know that, and you let your reader know that you're agreeing or disagreeing, you're evaluating the text. So there's two different moments in interpretation. One is the philological moment where you're interpreting, and the other part is the evaluative, the critical moment where you're making a judgment about the truth or falsity or the fullness or the depth or the value of what you're interpreting. So it's okay to read ideas of an author that into the text as long as they're not your ideas. So that's what I'm going to do to make it richer for you, because there's so much more to Plato's theory of human nature than just in these two selections that I've given you to read from book 6 and 7 of the Republic. And keep in mind also that what we're talking about here is the ideal state and the rulers of the state. But as I told you before, he's also talking about the stages of evolution of human nature. And that's how it pertains to our course. So what's the divided line all about? Well, Socrates is talking to Glaucon, okay, in the dialogue, and they're discussing the education of the philosopher rulers, like I said. So there are stages of this education. When someone is very young, Socrates tells Glaucon, they involve themselves in copies of this natural world. So what that means is, let's say the moon is shining and it's reflecting in a river, and somebody is walking next to the river. That moon that's reflecting in the river, not the moon up in the sky, but the reflection of the moon in the river, that's a copy of the moon. Okay, without the moon, there'd be no reflection of the moon. So the reflection of the moon is the object of the lowest form of knowledge for Plato. It's a copy of the sensible particular. Why does he call it the sensible particular? Because it gives itself to the senses, and it's particular. It's this moon. You know, there are moons all over in outer space, but this moon that we live with is happening now for us. So it's this particular moon. It's not the idea of moon that you would study in astronomy class. Okay? So that's called the sensible particular. That's the moon. Or any sensible particular. It can be a tree, it can be a rock, it can be an elephant, it can be anything. As long as it's sensible and particular. It's material, made of matter, and it's this particular thing. I'm just using the example of the moon. So if I look down into the river and I see the moon reflecting in that, that's the copy of the moon. Now let me read into this, not my own ideas, but Plato's ideas to enrich this idea. The power that reveals that he calls imagining. It's not the same as imagination. So just use the word imagining for that. So imagining reveals images. Images are copies of the sensible particular. Now, let me unfold that a little bit. It's a fuller idea than that. You can also read into that the notion of representational art. Now, that opens up a whole discussion of what kind of art is representational art. But basically, representational art is art that tries to enact a replica of something. So if the artist is trying to capture a tree and makes a painting of the tree, then that's representational art. See, if you study art history, you'll see that when in modern times, there was what they called impressionism, where the artist was freed to express their impression, their perception of trees and skies and things like that. That's called Impressionism. And then it moves even further to abstract expressionism, where modern art, they just call it modern art now, was expressing things that were not representations of things. It's called non-representational art. Some people call it modern art, like Jackson Pollock and things like that. So in the Republic, back to Plato, Plato banishes these poets from the ideal state, and that creates a big issue because the ideal state then is going to banish the poets. And poetry means art in general. I mean, there's poetry in the narrow sense, so like writing poems. Then there's poiesis, which means art. All art is poiesis, like music, everything. So the people that he's banishing from the ideal republic are the representational artists. And he also has in mind the theological poets who are creating these stories of the gods, who create all kinds of wicked deeds, and he thinks that that might morally corrupt the people in these republics that he wants to develop. So he's launching a critique of the theological poets and their literal interpretations of the gods and goddesses of ancient Greece. So that's a little richer in notion. But to keep it clear, just think for now, if you stay very close to the text in Book 6 of the Republic, he's just talking about reflections or copies of the sensible particular. But he's got something deeper and richer in mind. He's talking about representational art and copies of physical things. He also has in mind like hearsay, when you listen to gossip or somebody said what he heard or she heard somebody else say, and you don't go to the roots, you don't go to the actual experience yourself, and you're just listening to hearsay. Or so he's got that in mind as the lowest level of objects that are revealed through imagining. Also, when you listen to people, when people listen to other people talk, and they're just echoing what they heard someone else say, that echoing back and forth is a copy of something. So he's got that in mind too. Hearsay, listening to copies of what somebody else said, listening to people talk and not knowing if what they're saying comes from a deep understanding of the subject matter or if they're just echoing what they heard somebody else say. That's called hearsay. So he has all that in mind at the lowest level. Now I'm reading into the text, but I'm reading into the text things that I know from other dialogues. So I'm not distorting, I'm trying not to distort the text. I'm still doing what I call philology. All right, so that's the lowest level. Now, there's another stage that people go through. And the Greek word that Plato uses here is pistis, P-I-S-T-I-S. And they usually translate that as trust or belief. So what does he mean by that? He means that there's another stage where people become concentrated on the physical world, and that's sense perception. The reason he uses the word pistis there is that second stage, that second power of the human soul that reveals the sensible world, which is what? Perception, sensation. He uses the word pistis as the power that reveals that because he wants to underscore the fact that when we perceive something, we trust that what we see is how it really is. Like if we look up at the moon, let's think about the moon again, since I'm using that as an example. If we just trusted our senses without using our mind, the moon looks as big as a quarter. But as soon as our mind comes in, we know the moon is much bigger than a quarter because we know that things that are far away look smaller than they truly are. So the mind has to come in to make the correction. But without the mind, then perception can be deceptive. Or even on a more mundane level. Have you ever seen someone and they're waving to someone else and then you wave to them and then you realize they're not waving to you, that you always feel kind of silly when, or you look out and you see someone, it looks like your friend and it's really not, you know. So senses can sometimes be deceptive. So when we see something or taste it or smell it, any of the five senses, which all work together with the body, then we reveal the sensible particular. So if I look up at the moon now, I see the moon. I see this moon, this sensible particular. And so I trust that what I see is how things really are. So that's the sensible particular. And what reveals the sensible particular is the senses, the five senses. Now, these two powers, the power of imagining, which reveals the copy of the sensible particular, and perception, which he calls trust or pistis, which reveals the sensible particular. The objects of those two things constitute what he calls the visible region, the visible world. And by vision, he means all five senses. And note that the object on the second level of the divided line makes possible the first level. Without the sensible particular, there could be no copy of the sensible particular. Or with our example, without the moon, there could be no copy of the moon. I forgot to give you the dynamics of the line. Let's go back again. So the reason it's called the divided line is you make a dot and then make a space between the dot. This diagram is the one I'm going to give you is a little bit different than the one in the book. I always make a dot and then I make a space between the dot and the line and then just draw a line down. Then go about 2/3 of the way down the line and crisscross the line. So now you got two segments. Then take each of those two segments, go down about 2/3 of the way and divide it. And then take that bottom level, go down about 2/3 of the way, divide it. So you're going to have a line that's divided and the bottom portion is going to be smaller than the next portion. It's going to be a little bigger. The next portion is going to be a little bit bigger and the top portion will be the largest space. The reason the spaces is larger is because as you move up the line, reality becomes more real. So there are stages of reality, just as there are powers of the human soul that reveal these different stages of reality. So the lowest level is imagining. Imagining reveals the copy of the sensible particular. As this person evolves, they move to the second level, they become focused on the sensible world. And sensate and perception. Perception then reveals the sensible particular. And those two realms, the objects of those two realms are called the visible region. We should all you should also know that at the lowest level of imagining, he calls that word doxa, D-O-X-A. In Greek, that means opinion. So Plato is going to make a big difference, a distinction between opinion and knowledge is going to be different from wisdom too. So at the lowest level, the power that reveals the copy of the sensible particular, that's called doxa, but he really has in mind imagining. Okay, so now there's a decisive movement in the evolution of human nature. When you move to the third level, on the side of powers of the soul, you have two sides of this divided line. On one side are powers of the soul, on the other side are the objects that those powers of the soul reveals. When you get to the third level, or in your book is calling level C, they're just calling it A, B, C, and D. You can call it 1, 2, 3, and 4. Let's just call it 1, 2, 3, and 4 for now. It doesn't matter. There are 4 levels. And as you move up, it's more real. All right, so when you get to the third level, the Greek word that Plato used there is dianoia. D-I-A, in Greek, means through. Whenever you see the word dia, means through. And noia comes from nous, which means mind. So dianoia means through mind. It means using your mind, not your senses. So what does the mind reveal? It reveals the subject matter of the arts and sciences. So, like if I were to draw a circle on the board, That circle that I draw on the board is a sensible particular, okay? It's this particular circle that you see on the blackboard. But if I go to geometry class and the teacher gives me a definition of circularity, he says circularity in geometry is that the perimeters of which are equally distant from the center. That definition can be apprehended only by the mind. That circle that I draw on the board is not something the perimeters of which are equally distant from the center. It's imperfect. The other thing about that circle I draw on the board is that it's finite. One day it will pass. I mean, all I have to do is erase it and it's gone. But even if no one ever erased it, the molecules and the atoms would degenerate in time and it would be gone. So it's not eternal, it's not perfect, it's not identical with itself. It belongs to the world of coming to be and passing away. Now, this is important for Plato. It's the crux of his whole theory of reality. The circle that I draw on the board belongs to the realm of becoming, not to the realm of being. It's not just the circle, but anything in the material world belongs to the world of becoming. Whatever's born comes to be, it abides for a while, and in its abiding it changes, and it passes. It belongs to the world of coming to be and passing away, or simply put, becoming. That's the second level, the material world. When you move to the third level, you're moving beyond the world of becoming into the world of being. Now, being for Plato is more real than becoming. Why? Because it doesn't change. Because it's identical with itself. Because it always was, it always will be, and it is now exactly as it is. So what is it that doesn't change? Ideas, or what Plato calls forms. The Greek word is eidos, E-I-D-O-S, that's the singular. Eide, E-I-D-E, that's the plural. Most people translate that as forms. I like the word ideas. Or you could just use the Greek word eidos, E-I-D-O-S, or E-I-D-E for the plural. Actually, the Greek word means that which shows itself. But it doesn't show itself to the senses. It shows itself to the mind's eye. You can see it, but not with your eyes, only with your mind's eye. Okay, and this is an important metaphor for Plato. In fact, that metaphor has come down through the ages, and that's why we say, I see when we understand something. Or somebody has insight. Oh, she has good insight. Why did they say sight? Why did they use the word sight? Because Plato really emphasized that metaphor that you're seeing, but not with your eyes, with your mind's eye. So what do you see with your mind's eye? You see that which comes before your mind. What comes before the mind? Ideas. So now in geometry class, what comes before the mind's eye? Circularity, not a circle. The teacher may draw a circle on the board, but they're not concerned really with that circle in all of its uniqueness like an artist would. No, that's a pretty good circle. And I like the sway of that circle. It's a little bit of an oval, but it's not, they're not concerned about the uniqueness of that circle. They're just using that circle to illustrate the idea of circularity. And what they want you to understand is that the perimeters of which are equally distant from the center, which as soon as you draw a circle, it's not going to be perfect circle. So now we move into the third level. And so Plato uses he has Socrates say these are mathematical objects because those are the examples he's using. But he means something much wider than that, I know, from reading other dialogues and other parts of Plato. He means the subject matter of the arts and sciences. So when you go to biology class and you study about nerve cells, it's not this particular nerve cell that you're concerned about under the microscope. The teacher wants you to understand what a nerve cell looks like, all nerve cells. Or in geometry class, all circles. Or in astronomy class, all moons. Not this moon, But what is a moon? The idea of moon. Okay, so this is the subject matter of the arts and sciences, but it's most clearly understood in terms of mathematical objects, because we can understand the idea of circularity is not something physical. Okay, so most people stop with their evolution there. They become educated and they gain knowledge. The word for knowledge is called episteme, E-P-I-S-T-E-M-E. Now, your book doesn't make a distinction between knowledge and wisdom, and I think that's an important distinction. So the graph that you see on page 117 in your book, I would like to tweak it a little bit. I'd like you to follow what I'm saying. On level C, or the third level, that uses thought, dianoia, to reveal the subject matter of the arts and sciences and reveal those ideas. And I use the little lowercase I for those ideas, because there's going to be ideas that are ultimate ideas, and I use capital I for that. Or most people use the word forms. For some reason, I don't like that expression as much as ideas. But if you're going to use the word forms to translate eidos, then use a lowercase f for those ideas on the third level. When you move to the fourth level, use an uppercase I for ideas, or uppercase F for forms, or just say ultimate ideas. So but let's go back to the third level again. At the third level, what you're learning in the arts and sciences, in all the disciplines, is knowledge. You're gaining knowledge. So the gaining of knowledge is the third level in the evolution of the soul for Plato. Now, there's something that he points out in talking about this that I think is quite important. And he has Glaucon reiterate it, just to make sure that Plato has Glaucon reiterate what he heard Socrates say, just to make sure that the reader understands what's being said. And Glaucon says, what you're saying, Socrates, then, is on the third level of education, that when you're gaining knowledge, there's an assumption being made about the starting point. And you're not questioning the assumption, but you're generating a lot of knowledge based on that assumption. Now, what does he mean by that? What he means by that is, when you educate yourself and you gain knowledge, you don't question the foundations upon which that knowledge is based. And that's all right. That's the way it should be. Like, let me use three examples. One from biology, one from history, and maybe one from anthropology. Okay, so you go to biology class. You're on the third level of the divided line, and you're gaining knowledge of living things. But you never ask, what is life? If you ask what is life in the middle of, in class, for example, when the teacher's talking about, protein cells, it would be inappropriate. In fact, it would be inappropriate to raise that question anywhere in that class, because that's not the subject matter of the class. It's not a 15-week course trying to figure out what is life, but what you're trying to do is learn a knowledge of life. Or let's go to history. If somebody raised their hand and said, what is history? I mean, and you're studying the Civil War, and somebody raises their hand, what is history? It's inappropriate, because it belongs in the philosophy of history class. But without history, there would be no study of history, right? Or in anthropology class, somebody raises their hand, what does it mean? What is a human being? What is anthropoi? I mean, anthropology is the study of human beings. What is a human being? It would be inappropriate, because we're not talking about human nature in this class. We're trying to learn about the Aztec Indians or the Egyptians, or, there's all different kinds of anthropology. But anthropology means literally the study of humans. Biology means the study of life. History means the study of the past and the forces that affect the past. So the point is, at that third level of the divided line, there's an assumption being made about the starting point, like life, history, humanity, but it's never being questioned. And that's as it should be. Because if you did that, you wouldn't be thinking about the nature of life or of humans. Okay? So here's the big difference. And most people's education and evolution stops at this point. There's another level above that. That's the fourth level of the divided line, or level D. And the Greek word that he uses there, it's not in, actually there's a little bit of an error in the text. It's not really episteme, that the power that reveals that in the text, because I've checked the text in Greek. It's called noesis, Noesis. And that means the intuitive intellection. They took the word intellect and turned it into a verb, like intellection, and it's immediate. It's immediate insight into the ideas with a capital I, or forms with a capital F. These are ultimate ideas. So instead of learning about life, you're gaining insight into the essence of life. Instead of learning about human beings in different times and places in anthropology, you're learning about the principles of humanity, like this course in philosophical anthropology. This is not an anthropology class, it's a course in philosophical anthropology. Or in history, there's another discipline called philosophy of history. In fact, we're going to be studying Hegel and Marx, who are philosophers of history, and Du Bois too. So there's three philosophers that are famous for their philosophies of history. They're not asking about particular things that happened in history. They're asking about the common nature of nations, the stages that all of nations go by. What is history? So now we're moving to the foundations of the arts and sciences. Okay, this is important. So at the fourth level, that's called wisdom. The third level is knowledge, gains knowledge. So as you move from the second to the third level, you're moving from the visible region to the intelligible region. You're moving into the metaphysical. Meta means beyond, physical means the material world. And most people spend their lives in the material world. So there's this movement up the divided line. And these are the stages of human evolution. Now, what is this dot at the top of the line? I don't see any dot in your book, but I always make a dot at the top of the line. And it's not touching the line. It's important that it's not touching the line. So there needs to be a space between the dot. So let's go over the line again. You just draw a dot, make a space, and draw a line down. Then go 2/3 of the way down and divide the line horizontally. Then take each of those two spaces, go down 2/3, divide it horizontally, take the bottom level, go 2/3 of the way down, divide it. You have 4 unequal parts. As you move up, the spaces get bigger. The bigger the space means the more reality involved. That dot represents the idea of the good. That's Plato's notion of God. But he doesn't want to use the word God. They know the word God. They made the word theos, which means God in Greek. And he does use that word sometimes in his books. But in the Republic, he decided to use the word, the idea of the good. So there's this reality, which is the ultimate of all ultimate realities, which is really God. But he doesn't use the word God because for Plato, God is not a being, but God is this power that brings all beings into being in the first place. So it's not really a being. And because of that, he doesn't use the word theos. He uses a metaphor, which he calls the idea of the good. This idea of the good contains within itself all the other ideas, these ultimate ideas. And these ultimate ideas then are ascertainable to humans when they reach that fourth level of the divided line. And also, Plato thought that one's evolution is not reached its apex until you gain immediate insight into the idea of the good, which is this world soul that's projecting all the human souls and all the life forms from itself and contains in itself all these ultimate ideas. But let's trace these ideas down from the idea of the good, which is beyond being and the source of all being, to these ultimate ideas, which make possible the penultimate ideas, which are these ideas that they're not ultimate, but on the third level of the divided line. And then without those, there could be no sensible particular. And without the sensible particular, there can be no copy of the sensible particular. So on the level of objects of reality, there's the copy of the sensible particular, level 1. Level 2, the sensible particular. Level 3, now we move into the intelligible region, which is revealed through thought only. We have the ideas, which are knowledge. And then when you begin to question the foundations upon which the arts and sciences are based, which hardly anyone does, but the ones who do gain wisdom, then you move to the fourth level, and through dialectic, now I didn't say this before, but this is very important, through the power of the mind at the fourth level is called noesis, like I said, immediate intellectual intuition into the ultimate realities, which are these ultimate ideas. But the method through which these ideas are revealed is called dialectic. And dialectics, for Plato, is the method for revealing ultimate reality. And it involves philosophical conversation with other people, or it could be with your own self, but it's better with other people because in order to think further, you need to think against yourself. And it's sometimes hard to think against your own self. You need, in order to push forward, you have to think against yourself. And when you're with other people, then they can contradict what you say, and there can be a conversation that moves upward. So Socrates preferred philosophizing with others. So philosophizing with others about ultimate realities, that's called dialectic. And the method that one moves up the divided line then on that fourth level is called dialectic. And dialectic doesn't always achieve its goal at the end of the conversation, but it sheds ignorance. And there's another thing I want to say about the divided line before we go to the allegory of the cave, and it's this. It has to do with gaining insight into the ultimate moral realities. Now, what makes idealism, and as I said, Plato was the founder of idealism. What makes idealism different from other schools of thought is that the idea is more real than the sensible particular. That's counterintuitive. We tend to think that the tree that we're sitting under is more real than the idea of a tree. But for Plato, the idea of a tree is what makes possible this tree. This tree that's standing here is a tree because it participates in the idea of tree-ness. Okay, just like the circle that I draw on the blackboard is a circle because it participates more or less into the idea of circularity. If it's lopsided, it doesn't participate as well. If it's better circle, it's better because it's more perfectly exemplar of the idea of circularity. But it'll never be perfect if it's physical. It'll only be perfect if it's metaphysical, beyond the physical. Okay, so among these ultimate ideas are moral excellences, like the ones we talked about, the excellence of the human appetites, namely temperance, excellence of the human spirit, namely courage, excellence of the human intellect, namely wisdom, and excellence of our erotic drives, namely spiritualized eros that wants to procreate in beauty and participate in earthly immortality. So these are the stages of human evolution. Now, most Plato scholars don't talk that way. In fact, Plato is very much thought of as the spokesman of being against any kind of evolutionary theory. Because, and the reason is because he believes that reality is unchanging. But when it comes to human nature, I've found in my studies of Plato, and I do consider myself a legitimate Plato scholar since I published so much on Plato and been involved in the International Association for Greek Philosophy in Greece, which is the most prestigious association in Greek philosophy in the world. And I went 7 times and presented my papers and so on. So I've studied Plato very carefully. I do feel confident in saying that when it comes to human nature, and you won't find this in the secondary literature very much, as I just said, but when it comes to human nature, there's an evolutionary stages. And you can see it in the stages of the divided line. You know, I think I don't want to overwhelm you with one big giant lecture. I was going to just try to give one lecture on each of these philosophers. But if I go any faster than I'm going now, I'm going to just give you a blur and I'm going to lose everybody. So I'm going to follow my daemon. Socrates claimed that he had this daemon. He has this voice that spoke to him inside, that spoke to him. It never told him what to do. It always told him when he was going down the wrong path. So my daemon just told me that if I continue talking, I'm going to bore you and lose you. So I'm going to take one more lecture on the allegory of the cave, because it's so important, and I don't want you to be exhausted by the time you start thinking about the allegory of the cave. It's one of my favorite passages in philosophy, and I want to carefully present that for you. So I'm going to end it here, and but let me just tell you this as a kind of anticipation of the allegory of the cave. Those 4 levels of the divided line, they represent the 4 levels of the allegory of the cave. The first level is going to be the cave wall and the echoes and shadows. The second level of the divided line will correspond to that raised platform in the allegory of the cave, where people are carrying statuary and talking, and their words are echoing from the cave wall, and their shadows are being cast on the cave wall. The third level is going to be, of the divided line, is going to correspond to the surface of the earth, when the man gets out of the cave and starts seeing the trees and the animals and the humans and the luminaries in the sky. Well, not the luminaries of the sky, everything except the luminaries of the sky. The 4th level is going to represent the luminaries in the sky, like the moon, and this is all allegory, of course, in the allegory of the cave. And then that little dot above the line in the divided line, that's going to represent the sun. It's going to be associated with the sun, which is a metaphor in the allegory of the cave. So there's this perfect correspondence between A, B, C, and D, or 1, 2, 3, and 4 of the divided line, and the stages out of the cave of delusion and bondage, which marks the evolution of the human soul for Plato. So I just want to alert you to that for those of you who want to go on and read the allegory of the cave. But I'll give one more lecture on the allegory of the cave. I'll do that tomorrow, and I'll present that. But I'm going to try to limit my lectures to 1 lecture on each philosopher. It's just with Plato, I didn't want to race through it, and because of my admiration for this great thinker. I might have to give more than 1 lecture on some of the others also, so I'm not sure. I'm just going to play it by ear, because I've never tried to focus only on human nature on these philosophers. Okay, so that's enough for now. Go ahead and read Book 6 and Book 7 of the Republic, as I assigned, which is in that anthology that I gave you. And I'll be posting this today, and I'll make 1 more lecture on the allegory of the cave and Plato's theory of knowledge, or theory of human nature. All right, thank you.